What went wrong with Black Mage? Depending on who you ask, its changes throughout Dawntrail have turned the job from the most complicated job in the game into one of the easiest, or alternatively, has made the job actually playable for many others. And for yet others, the job is still too complicated to get it right. But what is wrong or right with Black Mage now? There are a few topics to cover on this, so let's talk about that. What happened? It holds somewhat consistently true for most of the jobs in Final Fantasy XIV that as the game has developed with each expansion, while new additions may have added further complexity to a job, quality of life additions have at the same time often also made the job easier. And whether the job actually increased in complexity really comes down to whether said quality of life outweighs the new additions to the job. Sometimes, reworks to a job has completely upended the system and made it jump from one difficulty level to another. And let's not kid ourselves here, I don't think there has ever been a job rework in Final Fantasy XIV that made a job harder to play. Black Mage is no different in this. Due to Enochian being implemented in Heavensward, the first incarnation of the Black Mage rotation as we know it today existed back then. But at Heavensward's launch, Fire 4 had a 3-second cast time, not 2 and not even 2.8. Due to jank that is still present in the game to this day, such as cast attacks, the cast time in practice was actually closer to 3.1 seconds. On top of this, Enochian was a complicated buff you had to maintain and extend with Blizzard 4. Stormblood comes, and now Enochian is a buff you simply activate, and as long as you don't drop your state within a minute, you can always just reactivate it if it drops. Blizzard 4 now gives Umbral Hearts, and Fire 4 by now has been 2.8 second cast for a while. Stormblood also introduced Polyglots and Foul, but it had a cast time, and you could only hold one. Shadowbringers introduces a new trait that makes the opposite element free instead of simply cheaper, massively reducing the difficulty of that specific angle of the job. Despair is also introduced as a single target alternative to Flare, which by the way still had a 4-second cast time. And Xenoglossy is introduced as a single target version of Foul, and now these Polyglot spenders are instant. Oh, and Umbral Soul is introduced so you can reset your state in between fighting. Endwalker comes and introduces Paradox, giving a solid option for the Ice state to have a reliable set of 3 spells to cast while waiting for the MP ticks. And it completely removes Fire 1 from the Fire state as well. Paradox itself also enabled a ton of strange rotations. Many of these alternative rotations wouldn't fit 6 Fire 4s in a single Astral Fire state and instead valued using less ice magic per ice phase at the cost of losing some fire spells per fire state. And then Dawntrail came along, which throughout the expansion introduced many things. Umbral Ice now recovers MP on ice magic casts, so now you just can't skip them. Not really. Paradox in Fire is now also instant and guarantees the Fire starter proc. Despair is instant too. Flare Star is introduced and is so strong that you have to get it, meaning that doing any less than 6 Fire 4s per Astral Fire state is simply out of the question, outside of extremely specific exceptions related to mana font typically. Speaking of which, this one was changed from recovering a pitiful 30% of your max MP to completely resetting your Astral Fire state, which was actually a good change. We also got a second charge on ley lines. Flare's cast time was also reduced to just 2 seconds, and Thunder spells, instead of relying on a somewhat random proc known as Thundercloud, which many Black Mages enjoyed managing, is entirely dictated by Thunderhead, which, while entirely predictable and not random, perhaps also seems a bit pointless. But the biggest one is probably the removal of the Astral Fire and Umbral Ice timers. So what does all that mean? We can probably both agree that nearly every single one of these changes made the job easier to play. While at times the addition of more options added more complexity in decision making, they ultimately just expanded your options, making it easier to play. Many of these changes over the years have been greeted with open arms, but a few select ones, most of which happened in Dawntrail, have not been so well received. Primarily because they made the rotation less flexible and removed random elements from it that added to the job's complexity. Simultaneously, the removal of the timers, while making Black Mage more flexible, for many also made the flexibility feel pointless, as whatever flexibility Black Mage always had was often used directly to play around the timers. The longer cast times of the past also meant that Black Mages had to be a lot more deliberate with their positioning, as they couldn't easily or freely move somewhere else. Additionally, some of the most easily accessible movement options the Black Mage had was things like Firestarter and Thundercloud, both of which were distinctly unreliable options, and saving them to be used at the right time resulted in a damage gain, meaning that planning out your rotation such that you need to move at those times, rather than reactively spending whatever you happen to have when you suddenly need it, was more desirable. Sharpcast, being an ability that allowed you to force one of the random effects to activate, also added a skillful and planning element to it. Another important angle is that the timers on Umbral Ice and Astral Fire were strict enough that, particularly for Astral Fire, being halted during an Astral Fire state, even for but a second, could either mean that you're just not able to properly finish it, or that you would have to get creative to make it happen. Sometimes this quote-unquote getting creative could boil down to planning for a shorter fire state, or sacrificing your opportunity to do AF1, F3P with Firestarter to ensure you can finish the current Astral Fire state, or something else entirely. Umbral Ice also changed quite drastically from Endwalker to Dawntrail. Currently, Umbral Ice causes ice damage dealing spells and Umbral Soul to generate 25%, 50%, and 100% MP respectively. Before Dawntrail, Umbral Ice simply improved the passive MP recovery you gain every 3 seconds by adding an extra 30, 45, and 60% of your max MP to the tick. While it might go a bit deeper, this roughly meant that exactly what spells you used in Umbral Ice wasn't super strict for you to gain your MP back, although Umbral Hearts came from Blizzard 4, obviously. You simply needed to hang out in Umbral Ice for somewhere around 6 to 9 seconds depending on what Umbral Ice state you were in, and then you could exit again. All of these changes turned a rather stiff, meticulous, but flexible, and somewhat RNG-based job into a surprisingly mobile and entirely predictable job. To be fair, most jobs in Final Fantasy XIV are entirely predictable, and actually surprisingly mobile too. But is that a good thing? Let's start with the positive angle before we get to the possible negatives. Don't worry, we will get there. The greatly reduced cast times makes a job that is already pretty difficult a lot more forgiving. Removing random elements or giving entirely predictable ways to handle them makes the job a lot easier to plan out rotations for. Making the MP recovery from Umbral Ice dependent on spell casts instead of a somewhat difficult to track MP tick makes Umbral Ice states feel more reliable and consistent. And of course, removing timers from basically everything, not least of which Umbral Ice and Astral Fire, makes the rotation at large way more forgiving than what it was. For a less experienced player, what often made the timers cause a lot of problems is that if you suddenly needed to move, this sometimes would come at the cost of stopping your attack, and doing so simply meant you were not going to be able to finish the Astral Fire state, meaning that a bad performance quickly escalated to a dreadful performance due to how unforgiving this timer was. Due to how latency can sometimes impact your attacking capacity, playing Black Mage on a higher latency could also simply mean that you could not deviate from the exact Astral Fire rotation, as weaving anything could cost you just enough time that now you can't finish properly, meaning that despite Black Mage's slower, GCD-focused rotation being more lenient on latency, the strictness of the rotation itself flipped it around and made it one of the worst jobs with higher latency instead. For a more skilled Black Mage player, these timers were mostly just a restriction that you played around. Once you knew what to do, the timer simply served as a guideline as to what you can and cannot do, which means that it could be interpreted as a job feature that mainly made the job unapproachable for newer players. This kind of interpretation can be applied to many of the things that have been made simpler. Umbral Ice recovering MP by using Ice Magic makes for a more easily understandable rotation, and playing around the MP ticks could arguably be considered unintuitive. The addition of Flare Star also heavily motivated making sure every Umbral Ice state included Blizzard 4 anyway. The randomness of proccing Firestarter and Thundercloud also added complexity to the job, and making the most of sharp casts to avoid having to deal with this random element meant that less experienced players that feel less reliably comfortable remembering to weave sharp casts were the players that actually had to deal with the inconsistency provided by the randomness. For the more experienced players, sharpcasting Paradox to get a Firestarter guaranteed, and then your Thunder, which by the way was more likely to eventually provide Thundercloud than not, simply didn't give you a proc, you were just unlucky. Too bad. Again, producing the possibility of lower lows, but in this case, out of the player's control. And finally, while the shorter cast times makes Black Mage a lot more mobile, this again mostly mattered to less experienced Black Mages, as the more experienced had simply found ways to not need to cast anything if that is what the fight called for, at a relatively reasonable damage loss. Again, ultimately meaning that the shorter cast times mainly helped less experienced Black Mages. So, how is that wrong or a problem? Considering how helpful all these changes are for, well, essentially players that are not hardcore maining Black Mage, how could they possibly be poorly received? Well, for starters, some gamers enjoy a challenge, and absolutely some players picked up Black Mage because of its difficulty, which then seemingly has been reduced with each expansion, with sort of one specific outlier. While quote-unquote non-standard rotations have pretty much always been a thing, the addition of Paradox and Endwalker gave birth to a whole school of non-standard sequences with over 100 actual pages produced on various particular sequences for use at very specific times and moments. Sort of producing a whole separate style of Black Mage that promptly and suddenly died with the release of Dawntrail. As in addition to the existence of Paradox, many of the sequences relied upon Umbral Ice to recover MP passively, and distinctly didn't plan to cast Fire 4 6 times in a single Astral Fire state, making Flare Star's existence a problem. And with the extra changes of 7.2 removing the timers and more, most of what remained also seemingly was made obsolete. It quite abruptly made a job that in the past was considered so complex that many players would prefer to only bring a job like Black Mage to a truly hard boss fight if they knew the fight front to back, such that they could spreadsheet the whole fight, turned into a job that is now approachable enough that you could probably bring Black Mage just fine on day one. In fact, Black Mage might be one of the better jobs to bring to start due to its simplicity and flexibility once you get to know it. And for the kind of player that picked up the job for the challenge, this is kind of a problem, right? On the one hand, does a job have to be so complex that it is excluding a ton of players from playing it as a result? No, but also, not every job has to be equally easy and approachable. It is perfectly okay if there are some jobs in the game that you simply don't like or find too difficult to pick up. For my personal experience with Black Mage, not to go too far back in time, in Endwalker I would regularly play Black Mage in more casual content, but I would never have brought the job to an actually hard fight due to how punishing it was to make a mistake. At Dawntrail's launch, I played through the MSQ as Black Mage, and despite the supposed simplification of the job with 7.0, I didn't find it that much easier. In fact, some might agree that the existence of Flare Star made the job more strict and punishing. Ultimately, I ended up playing other jobs for hard content. Then, come 7.2, I switched to maining Black Mage, specifically because the magnitude of simplifying changes finally placed Black Mage's difficulty at a level where I felt confident I could definitely perform reliably well with this job that I very much always enjoy playing. Ultimately, the many changes to Black Mage, and other jobs for that matter, leads us to Predictive Texting. As I said earlier, as far as I'm aware, there has never been such a thing as a Final Fantasy XIV job rework that didn't make the job in question simpler or easier to play. Whether it was Dark Knight or Paladin, Machinist or Summoner, Monk or Ninja, or even Astrologian. And while the many changes to Black Mage over the years has mostly kept the skeleton of the job intact, the many smaller changes add together for a job that feels almost completely different from what it was, and distinctly easier. Essentially, this means many of the players that enjoy a more challenging, complicated job, especially those that have been around for a while, see the writing on the wall, or at least they think they do, and expect that all of the jobs, Black Mage included, only will get simpler from here, whether that is true or not. Some say that part of what led to the explosion in population of players looking into perfecting Black Mage back in Endwalker was a result of all of the summoners seeking quote-unquote refuge after their job was made simpler, and so all of these players viewed Black Mage as the last bastion in this search for a complex job. And while for a lot of players, Black Mage is still seen as a rather complicated and confusing job, for someone who was deep into optimizing Black Mage before Dawntrail, it may well appear like a shadow of what it was, with what seems to be the closest to the non-standard the job used to have being mostly concentrated in the AoE rotation now. To sort of summarize, while Black Mage has been made easier to pilot with every expansion, just like most jobs, the addition of options has also added complexity. What caused the Dawntrail specific changes to be so poorly received by many of the existing Black Mages, not all, mind you, is because changes such as the removal of Umbral Ice and Astral Fire timers removed core parts of what made Black Mage to them. It was an overstep in simplification, and for these players, it feels like these changes were made specifically to make the job more appealing to other players who arguably have plenty of other options to choose from. Why does Black Mage also have to be appealing to them in particular? Especially if it comes at the cost of making it less appealing to some of the players already there. And I say this myself as someone who enjoyed both the Endwalker Black Mage, the launch Dawntrail Black Mage, and the current Black Mage, and in fact also enjoy low-level Black Mage. Yes, we exist. If Black Mage had not received the 7.2 changes it got, I would just have played something else for Savage, probably, and saved Black Mage for the casual content. And to finish, a strong reason given for the 7.2 changes of Black Mage was that they were necessary to make the job capable of competing in this much faster paced tier, and considering the sheer magnitude of necessary movements and forced stops by bosses becoming untargetable or taking away player control and whatnot, I could absolutely picture pre-7.2 Black Mage being on the brink of unviability. But I think what hurt these Master Black Mages the most was that they didn't even get to try to make it work, like they had so many times before. But what do you think? Do you prefer the new Black Mage or the old Black Mage? What is your favorite part of the job? Whether it is mechanical, aesthetic, or something different, I would love to hear about it all in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, originally, Astral Fire and Umbral Ice only lasted 12 seconds. Stormblood increased this to 13 seconds. Shadowbringers increased it further to 15 seconds. And then, it wasn't before 7.2 of Dawntrail that the timer was entirely removed. Imagine playing Dawntrail Black Mage with only a 12-second timer on Astral Fire.